everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Caryn's Beach Reads. I'm Caryn and I'm coming to you from Port St. Lucie, Florida. Today we are talking about romance novels. Romance novels have a special place in my heart. They didn't used to. I used to be extremely critical of romance novels. I just thought they were like weird porn for women and they were kind of dumb and they cluttered up book sales and used bookstores and there was really no point. But I have since learned the error of my ways, and I actually really appreciate romance novels now. I've been reading them as kind of guilty pleasure for years, and I think they're great. Not everyone thinks they're great, though. They do face a lot of scrutiny and dismissal. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, the New York Times wrote a roundup of this season's romance novels, where an 86-year-old man thought it would be fun to patronize and criticize a million-dollar book industry. But I'm here to tell you that romance novels are wonderful, and I think they're great, and we're going to talk about a romance novel today. And I'm going to talk about how I review romance and what it means to me. So I definitely feel that romance novels are for everyone. Romance novels aren't just romance. They come in a bunch of different subgenres. So there are modern romances and historical romances. There are romances with cowboys and supernatural romances. There are LGBTQIAP romances and firefighter romances and Amish romances and teen romances and military romances. There are romances that border on erotica, and there are romances with no sex at all. So within those genres, those subgenres are subgenres of romance. And these are the small storylines that kind of span all of the romance genre. Once you decide on a romance genre that you enjoy, you might find that you don't enjoy all books in that subgenre. You might find that you prefer historical romances with a friend to marriage plot. There is literally a romance novel on this earth for you, I swear. If you want a quick education about romances and why they're important, I'm going to put a couple links down below for you to kind of explore that idea on your own. I personally fell into love with romances when I read Janice Radway's study on romance. It's called Reading the Romance. It was published, I think, in 1986. And it's a little outdated now, but it basically talks about why women read romances and what they mean to women. I think it's just an important work, and I think the history of romance is important, and romance itself is an important genre. Over the years, I've kind of honed my taste in romance, and when I read romance, I kind of look at a bunch of different things. There are some questions I ask myself, kind of like the questions I ask myself when I read any other book, like, you know, a sci-fi book. There are different genre-specific things that I ask myself while I'm reading a romance novel. So, the first thing that you should know about romance novels is that they involve a hero and a heroine, and the hero and heroine get together. There is some sort of happy ending. Whether it is wedded bliss, whether it is a long-term commitment, whether it is a baby, that's all up to the type of romance that you decide to read. So the first thing that I look for in a romance is the heroine smart? Does she have agency? Very often readers will use a romance novel heroine as a pasteboard for their own thoughts and expectations. And by looking at the heroine and determining whether or not she makes good decisions or is a smart kind of person indicates my level of trust in her and whether or not I care what happens to her. So if your heroine is as dumb as a box of rocks, chances are I'm not going to like her or care what happens to her. And I think a lot of readers feel that way. The other thing I look for in a romance is the hero. Is the hero smart? Is the hero good? The most important thing about the hero is that he's good and he's not abusive. One of the things that I kind of don't like with romance novel heroes, and this is kind of my own personal taste, is when a hero is overly dominant, he tends to manifest behaviors that can be construed as abusive. And so I personally do not appreciate an overly dominant romantic hero. I feel it's more important to have an equitable relationship between the hero and heroine, so that the relationship can like move forward and that either side is not making more sacrifices than they need to for this relationship to work. But that's just a personal opinion of mine. If you like to have a romance with a very dominant hero, that's kind of your taste, and that's what you're going to look for. But if you're calibrating your taste to mine in an effort to determine whether or not you like the books I read, that's kind of what I look for in a romance. The third thing I look for in a romance is the story mainly about the romance? Sometimes a story can get bogged down with subplots or other ideas that can kind of hinder the development of the characters or hinder the progression of the story. So I definitely like the story to be concise. I like the story to be about the hero and the heroine and the development of the relationship. And if there are some other subplots, they need to be light. They can't bog down the story, and they need to allow the story to move forward at a reasonable pace. The last thing I look for in a romance novel is, does the romance have a satisfying ending? And I think you'll find with the romance novel that we are going to talk about today that I did not find it to have a satisfactory ending, mainly because I had a lot of questions at the end, and I felt that the story could have been expanded. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I do like my romances to have a happy ending. I think that's the whole point. So the story we're going to look at today is probably the most romanciest romance title you could ever hope to see. The romance novel I read this week is called Bad Princess by Julianna Keyes, and I picked this book up from NetGalley, kind of a website that connects authors and publicists with media members and book reviewers and bloggers. So I just kind of found this book and picked it up to read because I thought the plot sounded interesting, and it was a pretty short book to read. I read this book in maybe 2 hours. I'm an unusually fast reader. You could probably pick this book up and read it in a day or two. Bad Princess by Julianna Keyes is about a woman named Princess Brinley Cantrella who lives in the fictional kingdom of Estow. And her sister Elle has recently abdicated the throne and run off with a lumberjack, which leaves Brinley to stay behind and pick up the pieces. The king and queen of Estow decide that Brinley should just step into Elle's shoes and take on her responsibilities after Brinley has spent some time away to determine who she is. In kind of a political arrangement, the king and queen of Estow tell Brinley that she has to marry her sister's fiancé, Finn, who is the prince of Lenora, another fictional kingdom. And the two kingdoms kind of have a political agreement involving lumber and access to waterways, but, you know, that's kind of touched upon and not lingered upon, which is good. In the meantime, Brinley kind of has to grapple with her own emotions and kind of being stuffed into this role that she's not prepared for, and kind of clean up her behavior to make herself presentable to a kingdom in sort of like a statesperson kind of role. And she sort of has to grapple with her feelings for Finn, who she's kind of had a crush on for a long time. The first thing I really liked about this book was Brinley. She was an excellent romance novel heroine. She is exactly what I look for in a heroine. She was smart, she was fresh and entertaining, she wasn't dumb, she felt exciting and fun, she was a very well-rounded person. The whole point of her being in this story was because she had gone away from the kingdom for a while. She'd gone to university, she got into trouble, she was kind of seen as like the party girl of her family. And she wasn't held to very high expectations because her sister Elle always had those expectations for herself, and her parents put these expectations on Elle. Brinley was kind of an example of like a square peg being stuffed into a round hole. When she came back to take on her sister's responsibilities, it was really difficult for her. But I really liked her personality. And I really liked, too, that Brinley was not a manic pixie dream girl. She was not there to flutter into some man's life and teach him how to live and then flutter away like some whimsical butterfly. She was not flaky or flighty. She just had some doubts about taking on her sister's responsibilities, and I felt like her doubts were well-founded. Her sense of self-worth kind of took a hit when she realized that her parents were using she and her sister as interchangeable cogs in their family, which was, it was kind of disturbing and kind of sad. And she was more like a normal human being who went from living this free and unencumbered life to being saddled with obligations in an instant and having to navigate those obligations and her newfound captivity. So there were things that she wasn't allowed to do, and she wasn't taking well to that. And I really appreciated her reactions to that. I felt she was genuine. She was a really good example of a heroine. I also liked the hero. So Finn was kind of this like straight-laced guy, and he never got into trouble, and he never did anything untoward because he was also kind of in this like statesman type role. Finn kind of learned from Brinley what it meant to live a full life, and that's why I was saying earlier that she wasn't kind of a manic pixie dream girl. He definitely had his flaws, but he was also like kind of very understanding. He was very like steady. He wasn't overly dominant. He didn't try super hard to change Brinley into someone she wasn't. He kind of saw the ridiculousness in some of the practices that were in place in these fictional kingdoms, and I think he wanted to take steps to change those, but he just didn't know how. So the third thing I really liked about this book was Brinley's name. And I cackled for a long time about Brinley's name. There's part of the book where Brinley's father is reading these tabloids, and the parents did this religiously in this book, was they read these tabloids and they were like ultra concerned about what the press was saying about them. Brinley's father was reading the tabloids and came across one story that said the names Brinley Cantrella both translate to the word princess. So how horribly ironic that someone whose name literally means princess, princess, princess is so quantifiably bad at it. And in the acknowledgments at the end of the book, the author on purpose named Brinley Cantrella because it translated to princess, princess, princess. And you kind of, you get the sense that the author was having some fun writing this book, and I really enjoyed that. That was a really charming and special touch to this particular romance novel. On to some things that I didn't like about this book. I did not like that Brinley and Finn were both adults, but they were basically treated like they were 13 years old. It seemed just really odd and out of place. I couldn't figure out like if the parents actually cared about like the fate of Brinley and Finn's relationship, or if they were just kind of like almost evil. It seemed like they cared enough to ensure that Brinley and Finn didn't die, but that was about it. There's never any like moments between the parents that they kind of come to an understanding. I felt like that was missing. And there's one part where Brinley's kind of like looking back on her childhood and telling Finn about a time when she escaped the castle and accidentally ate a poisonous mushroom, and she spent 6 days in the hospital, and after that she was banned from going outside in the woods anymore. And that seemed kind of like an odd reaction from the parents. It would seem that it would have been a lot easier to either take the chance to teach her about poisonous mushrooms, or count on, like, trust her that she had learned the consequences of her actions. Meaning, like, she ate the mushroom, she was hospitalized for 6 days, that hospitalization was the consequence to her action. Like, she had already learned her lesson, so it seemed kind of odd that the parents were punishing her further by not letting her go outside at all, it was just a really strange relationship. And on screen, that relationship was never really touched upon with Brinley and her parents, or ever really resolved by the end. So I was really kind of put off by that. And I was also put off by the amount of power that both sets of parents had over their children. There was like one point in the book where they announced that Brinley and Finn are getting a divorce because the marriage turns out like is no longer beneficial to both kingdoms. So they just assumed that Brinley and Finn were forced into this marriage and that they should get a divorce, which is not what either of them wanted. So there was like a serious lack of communication between Brinley, Finn, and their sets of parents as to like what they actually wanted. And I feel like if some of that was like discussed, it would have been a much richer story, and that, you know, not only would the relationship stuff have been resolved, but some of the parenting stuff needed to be resolved too in this book. And that's kind of my third thing that I didn't like, was that the book ended without resolving any of the parental issues. The book ended, I had so many questions after the book ended, but it didn't really satisfy me. So I didn't know, like, at the end, Brinley and Finn decide to stay married. They kind of go back to their kingdoms, and that's where the book ends. So nothing really happens with the discussion with the parents, the resolution of a lot of issues, like, you know, the outdated practices that neither of them like doing, what a modernized role for them would be in running a kingdom or being heads of state. Like, that portion of the book I didn't really like. I thought it was kind of inconsistent and kind of like, there's a hole that was missing in it almost. Like, there was this whole part of the story that wasn't told. Overall, though, I would recommend this book to romance novel lovers, specifically modern romance, but if you like historical romance, I mean, this book would probably suit your taste. I would also recommend it for people who like gawking at the British royal family and some of the tabloid, tacky things surrounding public figures and heads of state. If you're obsessed with that kind of almost celebrity gossip, I think you would like this book. It was very entertaining to me. I'm not a fan of celebrity gossip so much, but this was an entertaining book for me. I would take this book to the beach. It was a really quick read. Like I said, I read it in about 2 hours. It might take a slower reader a little longer. So now I'm going to talk about some other things that I read this week and what I'm going to be reading next week. This week I read a book called Dragon Dreams by Ava Richardson, and I'll put a link down below to my blog where I review that book. That was kind of a young adult fantasy novel, and it had dragons in it, and it reminded me a lot of Christopher Paolini's Aragon. So if you like that book, you might like this book. The other book that I read this week, this one I read for City Book Review, and it was called Perfectly Undone by Jamie Raintree. That was a woman's fiction novel that was about a doctor who kind of has to come to grips with some things that happened in her past while at the same time dealing with feelings around her romantic relationships. I found that book to be very frustrating. I saw it on one of the newly released paperback tables at Barnes & Noble when I went the other day and kind of was browsing, but I was not a fan of that book, and I will link that down below as well once that review comes out. I had a really hard time with that one. That one touched a couple nerves that frustrated me greatly. So next week I'll be diving into a little bit of nostalgia with Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. I read the Golden Compass, The Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. I read those all in, like, I want to say late middle school, early high school. Read them multiple times and loved every moment. But I forget a lot of what it was about since it's been so long since I read them. So I'll be diving into those next week because he is releasing on Thursday a book called The Book of Dust, which kind of deals in the same realm as the His Dark Materials trilogy, and that was just, it was such a rich and wonderful trilogy of books. I just remember being completely enthralled by them. They were fabulous. So, I will be revisiting those this week and seeing if my adult tastes in literature live up to what I thought of those books as a middle schooler reading them. And in the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter, on Goodreads, I'm on Instagram, and I'll link those social media things down below. And if you have any book recommendations for me, feel free to email me. I'll put that information down below as well. And I will talk to you next week. Goodbye.